or you have friends that have missed this, this will be available on the Facebook page as well as on our YouTube, so feel free to share that link with everybody. You know, this is knowledge that I really think needs to be available to our students, so feel free to share any of our videos at any time.
So let me ask you something, Mia. Sorry to cut in.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is being recorded, right?
Yeah.
And so anybody can go back and view this later then?
Yes, unless you don't want that to
happen. No,
happen.
I'm definitely going to add it into my next newsletter and say, if you missed the interview, please go in there anytime you can see it.
Absolutely.
And people will discover the other people you interview and, you know, blah, blah, blah.
That's exactly right. It is definitely my hope, having the magazine, that some of this information gets preserved, and then it's a good resource for us as dancers and for teachers to continue to share it, where it's not just in print like, you know, Gilded Serpent was, or some of our magazines like Zagari used to be. It's also on video, so you can see the dancers, you can see the musicians, you can see these things. You know, we have a fantastic tool at our disposal.
Absolutely.
So here we are. I am Oriana. I own Fanoos magazine. If you haven't checked it out, it's at fanoosmagazine.com. We have a online magazine, and this was actually Ahmed Hussein's idea to start doing online interviews, and I love it. And we are here with Alexandra King, who hardly really needs introduction in my opinion, but in case you're not aware of Alexandra King, or you're just seeing this for the first time, I consider you the quintessential AmCab Bellydancer. I mean, when I was a baby dancer and I took your workshops in St. Pete, I was blown away by your knowledge, your experience, how you blended your technique, which I then kind of came to know through my education as the quintessential American belly dancer is a blending of different cultures and techniques. So can you tell us about that? You wanted to talk about American Cabaret as like the original fusion dance.
Yes, I can. That's why I'm here. So so I'm definitely not the only or the greatest. My teacher, Janani Rator, was the person who, you know, I still bow down to for wisdom, knowledge, and all that. And there are many women in her generation who know more than I do. So forgive me in advance if you're here and you're from that generation, especially my teacher. Now I'm sweating bullets. But, you know, Sahra Kent is from my generation, and people like that, Dalia Carella. These are all women who really represent this style, including our teachers. But we're really second generation, Dalia, Sarah, and I. So let me start by saying, I believe that all art, even ballet, begins as a folk style. And I think you've seen that or read that or put that out. In other words, ballet started as a minuet in social circles of the higher ups. The only exception to that, I would say, is probably classical Indian dance, which precedes all of them and was initially a religious thing. Same with Persian classical. So if you look at the origins and the genesis of dance, all dance that evolves into performing art, and by that I mean that not all dance is intended to be performed on stage. And so some of them went to that level of ability. And those styles that did were belly dance, flamenco, tango and ballroom, etc. Those styles were originally just for fun, that what I call social dance, what most people call social dance. Dance for oneself. It is subjective pleasure, not objective pleasure. So when the art itself, and you know, you can see it also in the sports, like Sonja Henie was the Norwegian ice skater who, you know, ice skating, right? Ice skating, you, speaking of cold, you just ice skate. She made that into an art because she was a ballerina. So now it's in the Olympics, right? Am I right? Anyway, so it's not, the arts themselves evolve to art because of the artists who do it.
That is profound.
Art isn't the artist. It doesn't just suddenly become that way. It grows because, as my teacher said, you know, a really good teacher, the sign of one, or one sign of them, is somebody who expects and hopes that their students will go beyond what they did and knew and were able to. I never did that with my teacher, Janani. I never became better than her or necessarily more knowledgeable, but I did take that to heart and have tried to use that back in the olden days as a mantra for teaching. When belly dance was a cottage art, in other words, it was underground and barely known up until the 70s and 80s, people didn't like sharing everything they learned necessarily. And this was something I came up against, and I was like, really? Why? But my teacher taught me the opposite. Share everything and teach it so that they get it and they become better. Well, you can see in her daughter that that was true. The only reason I learned as much as I did is because for me, dance was also a hobby. I loved learning esoteric things like Persian dance and Armenian dance. And I sought out teachers everywhere I could to learn those things. And then I discovered the Middle Eastern dance camp in Mendocino and just was eating cake all day and all night every time I was there. So that's kind of a little bit about me and my background. But in terms of belly dance itself, and it becoming a performing art, I have to start with the genesis of it back in the late 19th century, which everybody knows began in the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And I call that Gen 1. Gen 1 was sort of the street dancers, and that's where belly dance started, with the awalim and the gawazi, you know, as the artists who danced on the street. And a lot of them were prostitutes, and they were poor, and they were, you know, but they were sort of the geisha of their cultures, and they danced, and if they were the alawim, they also conversed and were literate and that stuff. So that sort of came into being, that initial awareness of the art of belly dance was that generation, the late 19th century. And at the time, it was the Victorian era. So you have to imagine that naked women gyrating on a stage was so shocking to people. It got their attention for sure. And then it went on to be, you know, part of a movement, a cultural movement that was within the Industrial Revolution, during which arts and sciences were growing exponentially because communication and transportation were growing. And so that takes us into the early 20th century. And in that period of time, in this country, something called burlesque and hoochie cooch, which literally hoochie cooch means a drunk woman's genitals. I'm waiting for everybody to go, what? It's true. And everybody had a different definition for it, but that was the US one. And it was from the jazz era that definition, hoochie, came into being. And women, and Freud said, well, it's okay to talk about sex. And that's when, he was one of the Industrial revolutionary people, and he brought up the idea of sex being something that people could talk about. So they did, because of course, who doesn't want to? And I remember finding a book in my parents, who were both performing artists, bedroom, of film throughout the 20th century, and there were a lot of naked pictures there. And I was shocked, because we didn't have that in the 60s and 70s and 50s when I was growing up. Nudity was censored heavily in film, not 100%, but not like it was. I mean, the things I saw in that book were just shocking. So during that period of early 20th century performing art evolution, the idea of sexuality and sensuality had kind of like exploded. And so hoochie cooch and burlesque were all happening. And under the sort of the umbrella of this generic term was any kind of sexual dance. Hoochie cooch kind of means, throw it all in the pot, any kind of sexual dance. That could be stripping, burlesque, or belly dance, according to, if you look up Wikipedia. Any woman gyrating naked was considered hoochie cooch. So that, eventually, that early 20th century was the beginning of three different tributaries of art, of dance, or belly dance, being born. One of them was Egyptian, and of course the Chicago World's Fair launched Little Egypt, and all the Egyptian consciousness of Egyptian belly dance was hoochie cooch. And then of course in the 1920, Turkey became secular. And so women could be naked and could dance and make money. Okay, so Turkish style sort of started developing in nightclubs as a form of commercial art. And at the same time, because of the Chicago World's Fair and hoochie cooch and vaudeville, which my grandmother was a big dancer in, we saw belly dance sort of in its nascent state as a form of sexual dance. It wasn't really belly dance, but it was hoochie cooch. So moving forward in time, in the early 1920s and 30s, we had in Egypt something called the wasla, which is a style of music that Kulthum was part of. And that means segmented music that was expanded and protracted and included taksims and other social songs that were really cool. And most dancers who are educated know what that is. And so belly dancers use what was called waslas, and the furqa came into being, which is the expanded orchestra to support that with 12 violins and 13 ouds and all these and drummers. And so belly dance was being born and raised during that period as a performing art that was becoming more expanded and sophisticated. And the classic style of belly dance in Egypt was going into development. Meanwhile, back at the ranch here in the U.S., dancers, the diaspora of Arabs coming and Greeks and people like that were coming into this country and settling in the larger cities and having parties and taverns and social events that didn't include Americans, but that brought them all together into a kind of music that we called Amaraba, American Arabic music. And what that was a fusion of Greek and Lebanese and Arabic and Turkish and whatever else they could find. Because, so there'd be a party. Hey, and some guy from Egypt would say, do you know anybody who can play the oud? Yeah, I can, he's Armenian. Okay. So this was just the way it was. The musicians were coming together to keep their culture alive. So you might have an oud player from Armenia, and you'd have a nai player from Egypt, and you'd have a Greek guy with a bouzouki. And so this is what Amaraba was. It was a mixture, a fusion style. Okay, so going into the cities, you saw American dancers coming in, and I wish Janani could talk here because she has a great story about this. Women coming in and seeing the dancers who were now, eventually those tavern parties and things became part of restaurants in New York and San Francisco and Chicago. And they were considered, performing groups. No longer the sister coming in to dance for the brother's birthday. It was now a performing group. So Amaraba was being born, American Arabic, during that time. And what was happening is all these musicians were coming together, and young American dancers were coming in and going, oh, what is that? I want to do that. I mean, a lot of dancers say that's how I discovered belly dance. I saw one, I went, oh, I did. And so they learned by osmosis and duplication how to do what these dancers and these women in parties were doing. They weren't professional. They didn't have backgrounds in dance training necessarily, or they may have. And they were bringing to the table what they had as a background. Like, for example, Jamila Salampur I think she was a circus dancer, but she had a background in performing arts. Mm-hmm. And other dancers, because in this country, we don't have prohibition on public performance. So I grew up dancing, ballet, jazz, modern, most girls do in this country to have some exposure to that. And so they brought what they had learned into the art. This was in the 50s and 60s, remember. Additionally, in clubs, cabaret has always been a solo improvisational art, even in Egypt. Solo improvisational, not choreographed and not group dancing. That came way later. So you had these club owners who were going, okay, our show is 1 hour long. And I remember that in Mexico City, I had to dance for at least an hour. I was opening for Amir Thalib. And I thought, an hour? oh my God, 7,000 feet above sea level, and I was already passing out and vomiting. So, but this, you have to understand, the Eastern mind has a protracted attention span compared to the Western mind, which is like 2 seconds. But back then it was a little different. People paid attention for more than 5 seconds to things. So in these clubs, you had this mix of music, and you had soloists who had to improvise and dance for a long time to entertain. And so the club owners were saying, what can you do for an hour? Well, I don't know. Let's see. So they'd see somebody with a snake in the circus and go, let's throw a snake in. Okay, great. So now we got snake dancing. And then you, of course, we all know Jamila Salampour was bringing in tribal. Well, she didn't know, oh, I'm creating tribal dance now. She was just doing what she did. And later on, it was discovered that she was the quintessential tribal dancer, as well as a cabaret dancer as well. Because cabaret dancers did everything. They were tribal. They were just fusion dancers. We are the first fusion style in the world. Because if you go to Egypt, they were doing Egyptian based on their folkloric roots. Again, folkloric. You know, Saidi. If you go to Turkey, they're doing their style of cabaret based on their folkloric roots. Rama. Okay, so in this country, we didn't have roots like that. We had whatever we saw, and we threw it into the kitchen sink and made our own style. So that's that. So we fulfilled the need to have a long, interesting act, and that's how we got an opening. And then, oh, and the veil was ours. I have to say we claim that. Even though it may have been done in other places, we made it into a whole art and a dance. Then we had the Taksim, which, you know, was a standing, slow movement section. Not very important necessarily, but in this country, we added floor work, and that made it long and interesting because now dancers are doing splits and back arches and body circles and this and that. And that, the audiences were wow. And then we had very little drum solo because most of what we learned was from the Turkish tradition, and drumming is not big in Greece and Turkey. It wasn't until the 80s when the Egyptians came in that drum solos became wow. So here you can see how this became a 5-part cabaret.
I was actually just about to say that yeah, the 5-part set that I've heard other dancers talk about, but the main complaint is that seems to have disappeared.
Right, and the reason why it came to be was because it was in a nightclub. You were doing a floor show that had to go on for a while to entertain the audience. And mostly you were entertaining Arabs who could sit there for an hour and listen and loved it because they were listening as much to the music as they were watching the dancer, if not more. Americans were stunned and loved it. But now, here's, you know, something to say about that. I've noticed that and I've thought about it. Now we don't, everybody knows about belly dancing. It's not a new thing. So we don't have the same interest or attention span to have a 5-part cabaret. Plus, most of the clubs shut down and became strip joints, or just we lost them altogether.
Right.
Restaurants, which led us to the 80s when, you know, we went into a sort of a change in our art. So up to the 70s, we'd been doing this sort of Turkish-based style that was protracted 5 parts. And then Egyptian came in the 80s. And all of us AmCabs went, oh, where's your veil? Where are your finger symbols? Where's your floor work? And there was a big, you know, actually competition or fighting or dislike of it. I remember the arguments and the discussions and articles and all the different magazines about how gross floor work was.
Wow.
And all of us American dancers were like, you guys suck. We're the best. And I remember feeling for a while really bad that I was doing floor work. Wow, I'm doing floor work. So look, ballerinas do floor work. When the swan dies, she's lying on her face. Floor work's a part of all dance. So is aerial work. I mean, up levels in art and dance as an art are critical, as well as angles. So in retrospect, I didn't have anything to fear or be upset about, but I was, because I was afraid of losing my opportunities to perform, I think, more insecure than anything. That was the 80s. That was the greater. I remember going to Ricasa, I don't think it still exists, and seeing women standing on stage with feathers and glitter and all this, and all they did was sort of prance around and shimmy. That's what we thought at the time. I said, well, what are you doing that's interesting? And of course, for most people, Egyptian was a lot easier than having to learn how to do a veil, play the finger cymbals, do floor work. That was hard. So while women were flooding into this art because it was now becoming exposed and understood and enjoyed, they wanted to learn. Women of all ages, body types, and backgrounds wanted to learn belly dance. And you can't learn American cabaret. You know, it's very, not you can't, but it's much harder than learning Egyptian. Now, I'm not saying that Egyptian is not hard, because the drum solo is to die for. It's so interesting and wonderful. But technically, compared to American cabaret at the time in the 80s, it was really different and very hard. You had to be young to do it, and you had to be, fit. So
much more athletic style.
I'll shut up now. What?
Oh, sorry. No, I mean, I could just get like a cup of coffee and just let you keep going. Like, I almost want to be like in your living room, like, okay.
You are my this is my living room.
Oh, well then, yeah, tell us a story. Okay. So I've often heard other dancers, you know, I didn't realize there was that much of a clash between the Egyptian and the AmCab style. So that's so interesting to me. What would you say to people that are maybe unfamiliar with the differences, as many are? You know, you were saying you had to be fit. It was much harder to be an AmCab dancer. Is it a more athletic style because of the Turkish influences? Like, what would you say?
No, there are more components to it. Okay, so because it was cabaret, it was a nightclub art, it had to be long. I remember the first time I performed in a private party as a cabaret dancer, and I almost passed out. I mean, it was so anaerobic. After 15 minutes, they had to carry me out, literally. You know, to dance for 15 to 20 or 30, and club acts were 45 minutes to an hour. That's a long time. You have to be in shape. That's one thing. Who wants to learn veil beyond, you know, coming in and flitting it around and throwing it over and getting rid of it? Who wants to learn finger cymbals while they're dancing? Who wants to learn how to do back arches and knee spins? If you can just put a pretty costume on and dance around and do a few steps and be graceful and pretty. I mean, it's really hard, American cabaret. And additionally, I'll go back a little bit ways, back to the hoochie cooch, so you know what this is, that the backstory is here. The hoochie cooch stigma of being stripping, of belly dance being stripping, was really strong, because in the 50s, this is generation 3, I call it, 50s and 60s, New York City had a prohibition on stripping. And so a lot of strippers came into belly dance because they couldn't dance without stripping, without having, you know, the chance of being arrested. And so if you were a good girl and you didn't like stripping, then you were going to be upset about that. And so there was another schism that was going on. Get out of here. We're belly dancers. We don't take our clothes off. Really? Looks to me like you ain't got much on, baby. Because our costumes were skimpy. You know, you wanted your legs to show. You wanted huge breasts to stick out because, you know, you were making money. That's how you made money. People put money, men, and that's the way it is. I mean, as much, whether you like it or not, that's the way it was. So this schism of stripping versus belly dance created a stigma that came through history. And by the time I got in the 1970s, I was tired of people saying, when are you taking your clothes off at a private party? And I kid you not. So there were these things called bellygrams, which were basically the same thing as a stripogram or a singogram, or these gram things came in the 70s and 80s, whereas people, oh, this was the newest thing socially, hire, especially for the wealthy, almost always only for the wealthy, or maybe an office party, hire a belly dancer, yay, and then always, you don't take your clothes off? No.
My gosh.
Isn't this enough? My big breast sticking out?
Yeah. That had to be so awkward. I've heard bellygrams are like legendary now. Like, you know, somebody that used to do bellygrams at this point. I never actually did one as a belly dancer myself. I think I was probably generation 4 or 5 based on your timeline. But basically bellygrams, where you hired a belly dancer to come and like almost prank somebody and like dance in their face and everything. In fact, there's actually a Simpsons episode where Homer gets a bellygram. Believe it or not, I'll have to dig that up. But would you say that that evolved into something else, or was that the beginning of the loosening of this 5-part set because now belly dance was being used in other ways?
No, this was parallel to the cabaret. As it was going out, so during the 80s, Egyptian came in. So what are the reasons why the 5-part left? The clubs were closing down, number one. There wasn't any place to go dance. Number two, it wasn't because of belly grants. They were just on a side. They were a fad that didn't last very long. I mean, I've done a lot of belly dancing at private events with other dancers like strippers and other styles of art, flamenco dancers. You know, the wealthy are the people that support artists. And so when you do that on the side, which we'll always do, it's a lifeblood for you. You don't complain about it. You take what you get, and that's that. I have to tell this story. I had a gig in the 80s, and I was a single mother and desperate as most of us are, artists. And a woman that was my neighbor said to me, my nephew, poor little boy, broke his ankle and he can't do the football thing, whatever it was, the football game. Would you please go entertain him for his birthday party? I said, of course, I'll give you a discount, whatever. So I got to the house. I had my little boom box and doing my usual bellygram. And somebody found him, and he was very drunk. Well, it wasn't very, he was a little bit tipsy. And he came up to me and he said, get the fuck out of my house, bitch. And I slugged him. Not only that, I picked him up and carried him outside and threw him on a table and said, don't you ever speak to a woman like that again. Thank you anyway. Goodbye.
Well, first of all, good for you.
I don't know if that was necessarily good. I had to go back to the club where I was dancing, and I was shaking. I was so angry. And this woman, and I didn't take any money from her because I didn't dance, but, you never knew what you were going to get into. So you were constantly either, it was an easy $300 or $150 or whatever it was at the time. But you also, maybe you were going to get accosted like that. Who knew?
That is a very good point. And I hear even a lot of contemporary dancers, usually when you start gigging and you start doing private parties, people are worried about that. Like, oh, somebody wants me to dance in their living room, or somebody's doing a private birthday party. Like, should I bring someone with me? That kind of thing. So yeah, and of course that stigma of like, you're more than just a belly dancer. It has definitely followed, and it's never really gone away. So.
Right. So in the 80s, it was really, let me say this as an overarching statement. Every 10 years, belly dance changes. And for us old timers, it was shocking when it started, the changes. But that's the way culture is. It changes. It's malleable. It doesn't stay the same. And the same with science. Everything changes. That's life. You either go with the flow and you lead it, or you follow it, intelligently. And I followed it. I didn't start any new trends the way Rachel Bryce did or Carolina Noricchio. And actually, most of those women didn't know they were starting. The story of Carolina, as I've heard it, is that she studied belly dance from Masha Archer and Jamila. And in her little bubble, she had created this style called American tribal style. And she came to Rakasa and danced, and everybody was like, whoa, what's that? Because they were using finger symbols and they had tattoos, and they were wearing dreadlocks and all this wild stuff. Compared to Egyptian, it was like night and day, and people were like, oh, it's beautiful, I love it. This was in the late 80s, early 90s, I think. And so it crossed over and became the new style, and everybody loved it. At the same time, Dunyavi gypsy dance was coming. In other words, globalism hit. It wasn't no longer American. It was no longer Egyptian. It was the whole world coming in. And anything you wanted to do goes. So in other words, it was kind of an extension of American cabaret, but we were no longer doing cabaret. We're doing American belly dance.
Ah, that is a very good distinction. You're right. You are definitely right in that time period. Huh.
And then 10 years later, Rachel Bryce came into being. She's a fabulous dancer, and I love her. She was a cabaret dancer, and then so you have to understand the music paralleled everything. So now in the I mean, Carolina kept the authentic Middle Eastern music going, but then Rachel Bryce came in and whoever else was her contemporary, and they brought in techno and breakdancing and all these American things that were part of her generation, you know, and so that took us into tribal fusion versus American tribal. So we kept getting further away from the roots of belly dance in Turkey and Egypt and more into a more American style of belly dance, which has in turn gone backwards and hit the whole world. So you go to Spain now, you can see tribal dancers everywhere, or Germany or Russia.
Right.
And it all started here. We're the ones that started all this change. I hear there's something called Lebanese, or no, Iraqi belly dance. I've seen a little bit of it on YouTube. No comment.
You're right. So one of my favorite questions to ask is these nightclubs that you were in that, you know, basically we don't really have anymore, or if we do, it's not the same. What was it like working in those nightclubs? Like, I draw the curtain back. I want to hear all the salty, crazy. I can't even imagine, because I mean, even just bars and clubs in general were so different than what we have now.
So you got a little bit of it by me giving you the backstory of, you know, clubs developing this art. Dancers made a lot more money back then because we were, you know, there was not a big supply of belly dancers. So they made more money, but they worked harder and they had to do more and they had to be more inventive. And my generation of 70s and 80s inherited all the work that was done by the original belly dancers, who basically took two avenues of development. There were the Aisha Alis and the people who embraced Middle Eastern dance as an authentic art without changing it. And were very disturbed when dancers who were creative and artistic in a different way made it into more of a creative art. So those were the Jamila Salampours and the Janani Rators and the people who loved the original stuff but thought, hey, let's do it this way. And that's how art is born. So in the clubs, when they were alive, were crazy. I mean, it was kind of like Hollywood. You hear stories about women in Hollywood who were bedded to make money and to get contracts. Well, it was like that a lot, at least in my experience. I worked in one club, a Greek club, for 12 years. And I worked in Turkish and I worked in Lebanese. And I'll give you a couple of little stories. The club that I worked at was Greek, was owned by a man who was a phenomenal dancer. Very handsome, very tall, very statuesque. He choreographed the dance that Anthony Quinn performed in Zorba the Greek. And so you can see he was really a good dancer. Hollywood hired him. He toured while I was working in his club in New York and other places. But he was also a madman. And that's basically it. If you want to take that concept of a madman, culturally, men in general, throughout the world, throughout history, have been mad, in my opinion. I'm not saying I don't like men, I love men, but they have the power. And so if you go to the Middle East, they have 100% of the power culturally and politically and legally. And so they took that power and dictated what dancers would do. And were very often not very nice. I'm going to tell you one story that it's not as risque as some of the others. I'm not sure I should tell some. But one night, I finally got a job, yay, at this club. It was called the Plaka. And it was 1981, and I had gone up north, and I had a white cocktail dress on with no underwear. And he made me fight for that job for years, told me I was a terrible dancer, could never perform, you know. And after a while, he finally gave in. So I came back down from my trip to say hi to everybody. And this was, folk dancing was very much a part of Greek clubs. And I came in, and there was a round table near and there weren't a lot of clients that night, customers. And one woman who was a regular there looked at this guy and said, let's dance. And he goes, no, I don't want to. And she goes, why not? Because I don't like you, right? You're ugly or something. He made some snappy, You're boring. That was it. He said, you're boring. So she took her drink and threw it in his face. And he picked up the table and dumped everything on her. Now, everybody that was there was pretty much a regular, a dancer, either a folk dancer or a belly, and I was the belly dancer. So that started a really funny thing of people chasing each other with buckets of water and bottles of champagne and different things and squirting each other, running in and out of the restaurant. There were 2 doors to get in and out. And this went on for maybe half an hour. And by the time it was over, there was that much booze and water on the floor. And it was a big restaurant. So I was covered from head to toe. I was completely wet. You can imagine what the white dress made me look like. A customer looked up at the waitress and said, do you think the owner knows this is going on? And she looked over and saw the owner, George, running around with another guy, dancer, chasing him with a bottle of water. She said, that's the owner. I think he knows. And then she said, and he goes, is there going to be a show? She said, this is the show, I think, tonight. Everybody was drunk and crazy. And then it went into throwing glass and plates on the ground and things like that. Now, the back office stuff is a little bit more tough. You know, today, if any of the guys that I talked to or worked with did what they did, they'd go to jail. And in fact, I tried to take this one guy to jail once. I took him to court because my son and his son would go out and pick up the dollar bills. And they were littles. My son, I think, was 5 or 6. And he had a temper. So this club owner went out and grabbed my son, threw him in a chair, and it really injured him. And I was beyond rage. So I took a deep breath, got my bag, and picked up my child and left. And his father saw the bruises 2 days later when he was at his house and called and said, I'm suing you, and you're paying the medical bills, you fucker. And so I came to work 2 nights later, and my paycheck was waiting there with a note that said, don't ever come back here. So all this stuff would never happen today. So I took him to court. I lost. And the judge that mediated in a private room said, who are you? I said, I'm the person that was injured. I'm the injured party. And he goes, no, you're not. This man is a big businessman who brings revenue into our city. He's fired you. He has a right to. You're an independent contractor. So I was a dumb woman. I didn't know anything about contractors and this and that. But anyway, so a year after I was fired, a Turkish club opened right across the street from the Greek club. Now, you may not know that Turks and Greeks have been fighting for hundreds of years. They hate each other. And so this was my revenge. The minute I saw the woman who married the Turkish man who was planning to open the restaurant, they had a TV show to discuss it. And I thought, revenge. So I called her because I knew her, and I said, will you be needing a belly dancer? And she goes, yes. I said, great, I'm ready. So I got the job, of course. And eventually the Greek people started coming over. They'd lost their big dancer to the Turk next door. And he finally he finally swallowed his pride and said, will you come back? And I said, yes, I want this much more. And he gave it to me.
Wow.
So that was one story. And then the Turkish guy was a real shyster. I mean, he left town one night with a big truck and stole everything out of the restaurant after his wife died because she was much older and she had cancer and he was cheating on her. So at one point, I was dancing for the Armenian mafia every Wednesday. He brought them up. He managed to find a way to them and bring them up to,
You said Armenian mafia?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Every country has a mafia. Just
wow.
So you know. So of course, I was the dancer there, and he wanted me to do it. It was a 5-hour lunch every Wednesday, which was for me like at least $500. I was stoked. So after a couple of months of this, he came up to me and he said, I want 10% of your money. And I said, fine. I want 10% of your cut, of your gross. And he said no. And so we started fighting and arguing about it, and I wouldn't give in and he wouldn't give in. So my husband went in to talk, my husband then went in to talk to him, and he took a knife and threw it across the room at the guy who was my husband, at my husband. And it hit the wall, not my husband. Thank God. And so then he came out with the husband and started yelling at me because I was in the room getting ready to dance. And I got on the bar and I started screaming at him and yelling. And these little women from this very wealthy community in Santa Barbara called Montecito were standing there to be seated. And I said, they said, "Oh my, what's going on?" I said, "Never mind, it's none of your business." And so blah, blah, blah. And I was screaming and yelling and throwing things at him. I'm not the only one that has these stories. I hope you guys all know. They're not peculiar. They're SOP in this world. And so those are a couple of interesting ones, right? You know, so you learn very quickly how to do business in that world. You learn to navigate these types of men. They were never women. And I've always thought, wow, why doesn't a woman open belly dance, a restaurant, you know? So I would love to do that, honestly. If anybody's out there with a couple $100,000, let's go into business, because it wouldn't happen. Maybe it might not be pleasant, or there may be issues, but
Right.
You won't be raped, you won't be beaten, and you probably won't have knives thrown at you and things like that, because it's illegal now to do that. And so I got pretty tough. And I know my teacher and friend Janani went through a lot of stuff like this and did the same things that I did. And she was very tough and smart and lived through it all. And, you know, it was just the way it was. You know, it's like you don't think about about your deficiencies or the difficulties and challenges are when you're in them. It's the only world you know. I look back in retrospect and go, God, it would be different now. But they always made me tougher and smarter and better at doing business, which I eventually ended up doing, and other things. So the club world ended pretty much in the early 90s. And then it became a festival-oriented art where women danced with women, for women, at festivals and at parties. And, you know, and that's really where it went. And of course, private parties and things like that. So, then of course the belly dance superstars came in the early 2000s, and we all thought, oh wow, now we're going to have representation, which is critical for performing artists. Representation is critical. Nobody liked Miles Copeland because he's a jerk, but he was a businessman and he knew how to make a business go in the arts. He'd made so many stars in music. So I thought, yay, and he chose really talented dancers who are today still, you know, top dogs on Suya Ratour. The three best ones on Suya Ratour: Rachel Bryce, Jelena. Those women everybody knows and admires and respects because they are really at the top of their trade. They know more, as much or more than I do. They are really good at what they do, and they're great business women. They learned also the hard way, touring. Touring's not easy, it's horrible. But everybody wanted to do it. I remember when the superstars were created, everybody was calling me, can you help me get the skills I need to be a superstar? And I go, well, I can train you and I can teach you what I know, but you have to get the job. And Miles was brutal. Nobody had ever been screened. Nobody had ever had to submit a resume or audition as a belly dancer. This was all mainstream art, and it was hard for dancers. And a lot of them hated him because he chose women who were, you know, slender or who fit the mold of the standard performing arts world. And that was just really novel. And so it changed the whole nature and landscape of belly dance. Of course, it didn't last. It went on for 10 years and then it died because of the recession, I think, primarily. Right. But also, belly dance just doesn't make the money. If you go to World of Dance, look at those dancers. Those dancers are incredible athletes. Audiences are very sophisticated today. When they see Derek Hugh twirling into the stage on his knees and doing splits and lifting girls, they're not going to be, when they compare a belly dancer standing there shimmying, they're not going to be as impressed. The world is different. We have, as you said earlier, the internet. So now we can see everything there is. You don't have to spend $100 million to go see something on stage. You can see it on the internet. And now we're seeing what's out there. And it's pretty amazing. I'd love to send a message to World of Dance, by the way, in case anybody knows anybody there. World Dance on World of Dance, because I think there is a place for this, for World Dance on the internet for artists that are in ethnic dance or in genres that are not Western, that require incredible athleticism. and they're just as entertaining. They're just different. They don't compare. They're like apples and oranges. Like, for example, if you had something called World of Dance, you could have flamenco versus belly dance versus tango versus Bharatanatyam. And it would be interesting to see how they came up against each other in competition. But you wouldn't get the same stoke as you would if you were seeing the Western stylists again. It would just be no competition. So anyway, that's a digression. So that's kind of what happened. We had the 5-part cabaret, then the clubs died, then all these different styles morphed over 20 years and ended up being, I don't know what it is today. It's now been the 3rd generation since, let's see, the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, 30 years of morphing, and I don't know where we are anymore. Where are we?
Yeah, I think that's where we're all questioning, especially right now. I mean, like you said, it evolved into festivals, and especially the competition scene, which is already controversial in and of itself for various reasons. And so, you know, we've seen the stylings of belly dance completely morph. So with your body of knowledge and how much you've seen over the years and how much you've seen it morph over the years, is there anything that you have seen absolutely stay consistent, or has it all changed?
Yeah, I mean, all the elements of American cabaret, which to me, again, is the first fusion style, still exist. But inside of a festival, when you have multiple dancers, you don't have a 5-minute option. You don't have a 20-minute option. You have a 5-minute option. What are you going to do? So some dancers do veil, some dancers do sword, some dancers do drum solo, and some do a couple of a little bit of other things. So those are all parts of belly dance still. And now it's so avant-garde that I don't even recognize some of the tribal fusion dancers as belly dancers. It's not that they're not. I just, you know, when you come in with a Scottish bagpipe and you're wearing, you know, Gothic clothes, I wonder, how does that relate to belly dance, you know? Maybe it is a higher form of art, but you know, it's just, the good news is that creativity is allowed everywhere in our art now, and anybody can do it, and that's wonderful. You have an outlet now in festivals and with the different styles to anybody can do it, and it's great. It's good for teachers because look, you know, I can teach anybody belly dance. I have a woman now who's probably in her 50s or 60s who wants to learn to belly dance for Halloween. Yay, it's going to pay that rent next month. You know, I'm not looking for a young neophyte who's going to, you know, have to train every day to be on stage. It's whoever can pay the money gets on stage.
Right.
Good or not. I mean, it's good for everybody wins kind of in that way, you know?
That is very true.
So I hope that answered the question. Do you see a threat? Yes. It's still the same. I mean, whether you're dancing to, you know, Kulthum, Amarava, or high-tech, you know, techno music, as long as you're keeping those the technique going, the hip drops and the locks and the shimmies and the taksim undulations, you know, then you're still doing belly dance. But where does it stop being belly dance? I don't know. That's a question to put in the, and where does it become something else? I don't know. I mean, that's something for us all to look at and answer, I think. People who are listening, where does it stop being belly dance and become something completely different? This is the question I'm asking myself. What is belly dancing now? You know, I mean, it's a free form for everybody. I don't think that you see this, say, in tango. You see a little bit of fusion and morphing, but not as much as this. Not as much as we have.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that from other teachers, especially of, you know, if, like, say, for instance, Nurhan Sharif is famous for saying, like, you don't go to be a flamenco dancer and use Irish music. You know, like, you have to stay consistent.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
feel free to drop in the chat, guys, if you have any answers or questions as well. Like, I'm here to read them. So if you want to put in your 2 cents, you can in the chat here.
Yeah, I'm asking everybody to put their 2 cents in. I mean, the further back you go in belly dance, the more you have a standard that is traditional. I mean, there's something called the ethnic police, and a lot of the university-based musicians and dancers are highly offended by avant-garde belly dance because to them, the only style that's legitimate is the original, authentic roots in the Middle East. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not the way the world is, and that's not the way art is. If you look at ballet in Japan, it's very different than ballet in France or Italy, where it comes from. if you look at flamenco, it hasn't changed that much. But if you look at flamenco, I go to every flamenco show I can afford to go to. It's, you know, men are ripping their clothes off and doing things that to me is almost offensive because it's so far from the traditional. But I understand that it's art, and they're in a process as an artist. You get sick of your own stuff after a while. I watched Suhaila Salampur morph into doing weird things too. That's just the way it is. You can't, and I have too. I've changed and done weird things. When I started doing Egyptian, I thought, what are you doing? You're an American cabaret dancer. Why are you trying to do everything else? Mm-hmm. And the truth is, I loved learning new things because I always trying to learn. And two, I'm curious about and enjoy, you know, seeing the way where I can go as an artist with stuff. Joni Mitchell, the famous folk dance musician, started doing jazz, and everybody was like, ew, why are you doing that? Well, because she's an artist and she needs to be fed, and she needs to morph and change and become more and be creative. You know, you get stuck in the beginning where your roots are, but as an artist, and so the audience, the commercial world doesn't like it when you change. And the same thing happens in a macro world where an art changes into this hugely different thing.
So Kat and Sheba have both said in the comments, and I have to agree with this, that it comes down to the music of how far away you're getting from belly dance. And I mean, you've probably worked with live bands. I'm sure you've worked with a lot of artists. The CD you gave me many years ago was one of my prized possessions until it literally wouldn't play anymore, and now I have it in digital form. So the music is central to the expression of the dance, yes?
I totally agree, and I've said it over and over. And this was when I really said, okay, enough. When I saw Tribal Fusion and they were using this techno music, or I don't know, new age music that was completely so far away from Middle Eastern music. On the other hand, people who agree with me, you know, on the other hand, most art, performing arts, suggest highly that you go be outside the box in your technique and your music. I'm now running a show called Bash, which is an iconic show in Santa Barbara of dance, and it's become more and more global. And it's recommended in our handout for dancers to go outside the box and use different music than what is traditional to your art. So for example, jazz musicians, they're telling those guys to say, okay, use some Middle Eastern music for your routine. Or to a tango dancer, use hula music or Polynesian. And okay, so that's maybe interesting, and it may be creative, and it may be challenging and fun for the artist, but for the performer, for the audience, it's not necessarily liked. So you have to look subjectively and objectively at your art and say, what do I want to accomplish and what effect do I want to have on my audience? And or am I just doing this sort of masturbating and artistically and having fun, trying to see how far I can go with tango music as a belly dancer? And you see is in music all the time, Latin fusion. I have a song that's Greek Arabic fusion, and then you get, you know, all these fusions in music, and they're okay. If they're well done, they're good. But once you start going too far out, which I think techno music is, it's just no longer belly dance. It's not saying that the dancing isn't, the body movements aren't, the music changes it completely. And the other side of it is there's something to be said for the originality of the art and keeping it intact to a certain degree so that it's pleasurable. I miss going to flamenco concerts and seeing the bata and the pitos and all the great elements of the art that made it what it was when I discovered it. And I don't mind seeing a naked man. I love it. But I don't need that to be impressed. And so that sort of bugs me when guys think they have to take their clothes off to impress us, because it's their footwork that turns me on. It's their attitude and their stature when they come on stage. It's the sad soulfulness of the duende and the rapid fire, stuff that goes on that really turns me on. And the costumes are elegant and dignified in flamenco. And now we're taking our clothes off, people? Yeah, I can see that in Polynesian because it's hot. And I love seeing women with coconut hole things on and grass skirts because that's part of their culture. So there was challenge when I went back to college in the 90s that I was in a writing class, and you had to answer this question: should globalism take over and end original cultures, or should it not? And I went on the side of it should not, because one of the great things about our cultures, our world culture, is the beauty of the indigenous culture. You could take that and extrapolate from that. Oh, well, then black and white people should never get married, right? And I went, no, that's not the point. There are hybrids all the time, but when the hybrid becomes the norm and we don't even have the original anymore, imagine a world without black people or white people or Greek or, Orientals. It would be a sad world. A little bit of it's great. And of course, flamenco is a fusion. It's Indian and Spanish and Arabic mixed. So it's a grandchild of three cultures, and it came out really well. It doesn't always come out really well, And I think tribal fusion came out really well too. But the question is, we in tribal fusion, we've pretty much lost the music that was so fabulous and is so fabulous. Turkish and Arabic and Lebanese music.
That actually ties into what Ansuya just wrote in the comments, and I'm going to read this out loud because it's so fantastic. For us, the quintessential belly dancer is capable of improvising the 5-part cabaret to a live band that is also improvising or has improvisational sections. This is in order to achieve the high altered states that improv to specifically Middle Eastern music and tones can provide. However, since we are the original fusion art form, we feel all is welcome and inspiration should be based on each individual. The trick, we think, is to preserve and evolve. The only thing we don't appreciate is when new styles bully older styles out. Let's keep them all. And I have to agree with that 1,000%, because, as artists, you're absolutely right. You can't work in a vacuum, and you should stretch, and you should have the freedom to stretch and grow and change and explore and research other movement vocabularies. But I love how she said, we don't appreciate when new styles bully the older ones out. You should still be able to see all of them. And I think you and Sarah and a lot of your contemporaries are really great examples of that. And I love watching belly dancers of all stripes for many different reasons. I like seeing how things have changed, stayed the same, things like that. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything that has gone away that you wish had stayed? Is there anything from when you were performing in the clubs or the music or anything that has changed or gone away that you wish had stayed?
Well, Ansuya said it pretty much. And actually, I wanted to comment on the bullying thing. Bullying goes two ways. I mean, old timers like me bullied the new timers and went, ooh, ooh, ooh. I said that earlier, right? And it wasn't until later that I went, that was very mean of me and wrong, because they're being creative and it's developing a new art. Look what we got with flamenco. It's not right to. It's the insecurity of the older dancers that pushes them to bully the younger new age ones, and vice versa. And that's true of all people in all situations. Most of the time bullying comes from insecurity, or you learned it as a child. So I don't like bullying either. And I think that's a really good point. Thanks, Ansuya. The thing I miss the most is the improvisational element, because a true artist can improvise. Now, that said, I learned to belly dance as an improvisational artist. My teacher and all teachers back then didn't teach us choreography. I had no idea what choreography was or how to do it, but Egyptian style brought it in. There's Americo-Egyptian. So you realize that every time a new culture comes into belly dance, when it was Egyptian, it was modified by American dancers. So Suhaila is the quintessential queen of American Egyptian, just like her mother was for tribal. I mean, they're the queens of the art. So I hit the road running on stage as an improvisational dancer, and I had to train myself to be a choreographer. I really trained. I learned. I read every book. I studied everything I could. I took classes until I learned what the Doris Humphrey principles were and methods of choreography, and now I teach them in as a workshop thing, because there are rules and there are methods to choreography, but the true artist can get up and dance, and that takes years if you didn't learn it from day one. And that's true with musicians. Sadly, we don't have the musicians that we had back in the day in the 60s and 70s anymore. The Greeks and the Arabs and those people. When I was working in Mexico City at a club called Adonis, it was a Lebanese club restaurant. This man had an empire there, this Lebanese man and his brothers. And it was a band, it was an Arabic band. And it was such a pleasure to spend an evening performing to live music. It was even in, I mean, the 80s is when it all started dying and not having. Then I worked for the Middle East Ensemble for 20 years as the artistic director, and I founded the dance ensemble, and that was a pleasure beyond belief, you know, working with live music. Even though most of the musicians were students, it wasn't club level skill. It was still a great pleasure to get up and walk over to the canoonist and do a tuxine with a canoon, and walk over to the drummer, the famous Sue Rudnicki, and dance with her. That was such a pleasure, I have to say, because it's live, it's human, it's in the moment. And as wonderful as recordings are and as choreography is, and that makes it easy for a teacher, right? Like Ansuya said, it's improvisation that I missed.
Well said. Absolutely well said. So we are at 8 o'clock my time, which I think is 5 your time? Oh, wow. So does anybody have any questions? We can keep talking, but if you have any questions for Alexandra King, please drop them in the chat and I will bring them up for you. Anything at all in this time. And while I'm waiting for questions to come in, you've traveled all over the world. You've pretty much been to all the major spots of where this dance has come from. What was your favorite? Did you have one that was like really profound for you?
Well, for music and dance, it was Turkey. And the reason why was because the music and dance there is still Turkish. You go into a club in Istanbul and they do Turkish style belly dance, and they do Turkish folk dance on stage, and they use Turkish instruments. You go into Egypt and they've got guitars, and they still do Egyptian, modern Egyptian, and they do pop Egyptian, which if you told my friend Tamara Henna of Los Angeles, talk to her about, ask her what she thinks of Egyptian modern. I think she likes it, but she was shocked when it came out because she lived and worked in Egypt for a long time. They've really morphed their art a lot, and Turkey kept its roots. So I loved Turkey for that reason. I would wake up and go up to the park every morning where I was and folk dance with people. And they were shocked. What's this old white lady doing here folk dancing with us? So, yeah, that's the country I like the most. And Turkey's beautiful. Not that Egypt isn't, but it's, to me, I preferred it.
No, I hear there's a big difference in the beauty of the city and then the cleanliness and the culture.
And it's secular. Yeah. So as a woman, it was easier to get around. I went, let's just say that I went to see Dina in Cairo, and I was alone because I'm always alone. I prefer it. And I was almost prohibited from coming in. But when I did get in, I was put in the back of the room and I was looked down on. When I went to Turkey a month later, I was embraced. Madam, come. You're a dancer. Oh, please, let me give you one seat right here in front of the stage. Thank you very much. So you're more of a human in Turkey as well.
Wow. Wow, what a difference. Is there any country that surprised you? Anything that you thought would be different, or you got there and you were like, oh, anything that jumped out at you in your travels that really stunned you, or like a stereotype you found that wasn't true?
So the closest answer to that is Greece. I love Greek folk dancing. And of course, I worked in a Greek club for 12 years, went to a lot of Greek clubs in the States. So I love the food. I love the dancing. I love everything about it. And I couldn't wait. So I spent almost a month in Crete. And that's a funny story. I'll tell it sometime. But I ended up going to Athens, and I was horrified. I hated it beyond belief. So I had a room. It was July. It was super hot. And my next stop was India. And I went to the counter. I went to the Saudi Air, and I said, after about a week there, I said, I have to leave. And I'd forgotten to get a visa to go to India because that was my next stop. So I got to the airport and waited in line with chickens and all the other people that were going to India. Got to the counter. She said, "Where's your visa?" I said, "What visa?" And she said, "You can't go to India without a visa." I had to go back to Athens. I was so upset. If I don't get my way, I'm a princess, and I got very upset. And I ended up, couldn't find a hotel, but I finally did. And I had this terrible, filthy room on the 3rd floor. And I walked into it, and this man was sitting there with guns, cleaning them. He was a hitman. I said, "Hi, what are you doing?" He goes, "I'm getting ready to kill someone." Something like that. It came across really clear. I went, "Oh God." But I ended up sticking it out for another few days, and I finally went back to Saudi Air, and I said, "Dude, where can I go that's Islamic, but not India?" He goes, "Java." And I said, "Book me tomorrow." So I went to Java. Did not like Athens.
Well, all right.
But that's not a
Duly
dance. That
noted.
doesn't have to do with the dance. That's just the culture. It was a big city. It was hot. I asked a cab driver to take me to a rebetiko club. He didn't take me to a rebetiko. Now, this is not to say that other cities wouldn't do this, but it happened to me there. He took me 2 blocks away and charged me $20 and said, "Right up there, just go right up there." And I got out and walked up the stairs. There was nothing but a graveyard, I think.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So it wasn't a very good experience.
Jeez. I can't even imagine. I'd be so upset. So tell us what else is going on with you. Are you teaching online classes? Do you have anything coming up you'd like to tell everybody?
Yes, thank you. I teach online, only teach privates now. I have 1 drumming class on Thursday. And then I'm also putting on a show. We have a studio here called Hamza. It's owned by a lovely lady. It's in Ojai. It's a humongous studio, quite beautiful. And she's struggling to stay alive. So somebody suggested I do Best of Alexandra King, an online concert, because she's been doing them. And they said, "Why don't you do one? Best of Alexandra King." I went, "That's pretty egomaniac." And they said, no, it would get a lot of people. And I said, "Okay." So we put together a 1-hour show on November 15th, which is my birthday. And we're doing a 1-hour show online called Facing East, Best of Alexandra King. So hopefully people will come to that, and there'll probably be a pay-per-view afterwards. And our fingers are crossed that she keeps the studio going and that my concert will help her.
Absolutely. That would be fantastic. Make sure you share that information with me. I'll put it up on the Fanoos magazine Facebook page and on the website. And, you know, everybody keep your eyes out for that. That would be fantastic. Anything that we can do to support the arts, especially right now, is a massive, massive help. And if nobody else has any questions, we will wrap this up. Again, to answer your questions, this will be available on the Fanoos Magazine YouTube channel as well as on the Facebook page. Feel free to share, like, comment, send to your students, send to your teachers, send to your family, your dog, your cousin, everybody. And if you can access all of our social media as well as all of our issues and our articles at fanoosmagazine.com. And I am so thrilled to have had this time with you, Alexandra. And
me with you. Thank you.
I'm so happy to see you again after all this time. And I hope that we can all stay connected. And if there is anybody, you guys out there, that you would like to see interviewed, you have an idea, you want to see Alexandra come on again and ask more specific questions about something, if you have a teacher, a friend, a dancer you've always wanted to talk to, let me know. You can find me on Facebook at Fanoos Magazine. And if you got something to say, I want to talk to you. Like, if you have some history, you got an opinion, I'm here for it. This is the space for it. And I thank you so much, everybody, for all of your support. And Alexandra, thank you for doing this with us and sharing your wealth of knowledge. So great to see Alexandra after 30 years and hear this history. Wow. Yes, indeed. Yes.
A little longer than that, but we won't talk about that.
Well, we won't go there, but
let's put it at 20, okay?
20 in a day, it's nothing.
Yeah.
Amazing to see Alexandra, such a wealth of knowledge and a storyteller. Where's the book? Where indeed is the book?
Well, actually, I just finished a screenplay. It's called Muscovado. It's the story of the 1733 slave rebellion on St. John, which is where I'm from, and it's actually a love story. I'm learning how to do this, which is my dream, and the next one is my story.
I was going to say, I think you definitely have enough material and then some for the autobiography of the century. It could be Facing East, the story of Alexandra King. I mean, you really have, you've got a lot. You can't make this stuff up. You've got to put it down.
Thank you for saying that and for that idea. I think a lot of belly dancers would enjoy it, because how many belly dancers had written an autobiography, right? It's time for people to start sharing.
I completely agree with that. And I do think
Not
that
just
would
me,
be
but there's a lot of women who have, like, for example, Janani could write a autobiography that would blow mine out of the water. She's
Could
my
you
teacher.
imagine like a chicken soup series where there's like all these stories from different dancers, like pita and hummus for the belly dance soul, and it has all these anecdotes? That would be amazing. But I do think you and Janine and so many other people should write their autobiographies, get it out there. So we're just saying, you know, we might need to have some crowdfunding for this club, the movie, and your book. We're gonna have to start pulling some. Everybody start saving your spare change, guys. We gotta do this. Okay. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you so much to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and your evening, no matter where you are. And hopefully we will see you again. Alexandra, I cannot thank you enough.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. Bye, friends. I love you guys. Mwah, 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 mwah. Bye, Teresa. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again.